Hey guys! So a little while back I did a tour of a gray toned sketchbook I had completed, and that was actually my first experience with toned paper in any capacity. There was definitely an adjustment period that came with working on that sketchbook, and it took me a little while to get used to the differences between a toned paper and a white paper. There were a lot of things I learned working on that sketchbook, thanks to a lot of trial and error, and I thought that it would be interesting to do a video talking about some of the little tips and tricks that I learned. Hopefully, if you've never used toned paper before, or you've been struggling with it, this will kind of give you a jumping off point so that you don't have to do quite as much trial and error. Though there's definitely nothing wrong with that, and I encourage it regardless. I will leave a link to the cardstock and other supplies that I'm using in this video in the description, but essentially it's just a tan craft paper. I briefly mentioned this cardstock in my last video. It was something that I had initially invested in to use for packaging for my Etsy shop. However, as I did different test prints, I started to color on it and kind of experiment a little, and I thoroughly enjoyed the process of working on it. Now, I'm going to be doing two different examples in this video, just so you can see a variety of different techniques and materials used specifically on toned paper. With my first example, I decided to actually skip the drawing part and jump straight into the coloring part. And the way that I'm doing this is by using one of the digital stamps that are available in my Etsy shop. Because it is a file with a transparent background, it makes it possible to print directly onto craft paper without having to worry about anything getting in the way of that. And this image specifically is just one that I have colored over and over again and have not gotten tired of yet. Now, first things first, if you've ever heard anything about toned paper, you've probably heard this, but it is one of the cool things about toned paper, so I wanted to mention it. And that is that the color of the paper itself acts as the mid-tone of your drawing. This means that all you have to do is add the shadows and highlights, and you already have something that's looking kind of three-dimensional. It makes things like sketches and drawings and just the general coloring process quite a bit quicker, and it can be a good way to get your ideas down onto paper in a manner that is faster than you might be used to. Now, through all of my experimentation with toned paper, one of the first things I noticed looked really good on it was alcohol markers. I am using the Ahuhu brand of markers here. They're very cheap and very good for just generally sketching and getting your ideas down. Now, the reason I decided to use alcohol markers in my first example is that they become very vibrant and stand out quite a bit differently on toned paper than they do on white paper. At least in my experience, that has been the case. By the end of my toned gray sketchbook, I had determined that colored pencil and alcohol marker was my favorite combination of materials to use. And that is why I wanted that to be the first example that I showed. Now, with the girl that I'm coloring here, I colored in the details with different colors. Things like her hair and her shirt and her earrings. This made them stand out from the toned paper itself just because they were a different color. However, as far as the base skin color was concerned, I decided to keep it the color of the paper just because it allows me to further emphasize the idea of shadows and highlights that I mentioned previously. And in order to do this, I actually did use a single color of alcohol marker in just a tiny bit of a darker shade than the paper itself, to add some shadows. And once the main colors are down in your alcohol marker, you can go in with colored pencils to deepen those shadows and add highlights. I'm using Prismacolor pencils in this video. I just like the way that they lay down on toned paper. Though, full disclosure, I haven't really tried much of anything else. And then, for what is probably my favorite part of working on toned paper. In order to really finalize the design, I like to use a white pencil to go all the way around the outside of whatever I'm drawing. This really separates it from the background and makes it stand out. And then, of course, you can add any details or highlights you may want to using a white gel pen, or you can continue using your white pencil. Now, moving on to our second example, I'm going to be using watercolors instead of alcohol markers. Now, the first thing to note about this is that this paper I'm using is not watercolor paper. It seems pretty self-explanatory, but because it's not watercolor paper, it will react differently than it would on a paper specifically made to use with wet mediums. However, continuing with the theme of trial and error, I knew that I wanted to do something of this nature just to show you that it was indeed possible. Now, as with the first example I did, I decided that with this piece I would continue the trend of leaving the skin as negative space. Of course, I could have painted it all with watercolor, but I figured that would kind of eliminate the point of using the toned paper in the first place. This also creates a focal point that draws the eye to the figure itself, because there is a contrast there. When everything else in your painting is dark and one bit is light, your eye is automatically going to be drawn to that area. Now, starting with the background, I worked with a wet and wet technique. I was really trying to get the colors to swirl together. I worked with a turquoise and a purple, really trying to play with those cool colors that I tend to enjoy. Now, because this paper is not a watercolor paper, it did sink in more than I was expecting, which actually created an effect that I really liked. I think this is definitely the value of experimentation, because you're never going to know until you try. And then, once the watercolor was completely dried, this was where we started to move into some of the same techniques we used with our first example. After inking the piece, I used colored pencil to add more depth to my shadows, and to otherwise just add details. For me specifically, one of my very favorite parts of drawing portraits on toned paper is adding in the whites of the eyes. You can do this with pencil or a gel pen, whichever suits you better, but I always find that it really brings whatever I'm drawing to life. And sometimes it's one of those things where I feel like something's missing. I'm working on a drawing and it feels not right. And then I'll realize that I actually forgot to add in the whites of the eyes, and that's exactly what it needed to make sense. So all in all, I hope that this video was useful to you in some way, and that you learned something that you didn't know before about working on toned paper. Thank you all so much for watching. You can subscribe if you want, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.